Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, over the last 24 hours, there has been a series of massive Russian airstrikes with the use of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, and drones against more than 200 Ukrainian aim points. The targets of these missile strikes were industrial capacity. There were strikes against energy capacity that is designed to continue to propel the Ukrainian war effort. Now, what we're hearing is that this was one of the more successful series of strikes by the Russians against a great many targets throughout much of the Ukraine. Now, additionally, we are hearing reports that both the Ukrainians and the Belarusians are building up forces on their shared border. Now, is the armed forces of Belarus a threat to Ukraine? To the Ukraine? It is not. Now, could Russian forces also be used in an offensive operation in the direction of Kiev? Absolutely. But as of right now, the Russians do not have the force composition in southern Belarus to launch the type of operation that some in the Ukrainian circles are talking about. Now, additionally, we're also seeing a buildup of Ukrainian forces as well. Now, here in the West, with the mainstream media, we keep hearing that this quote of the Belarusians have deployed a third of their entire armed forces to the border. Now, look, you have to compare and contrast the size of the Belarusian armed forces with that of the Ukrainian armed forces. By some estimates, there are reports between border troops, National Guard troops, and ground forces that the Ukrainians could have as many as 100 to 120,000 troops along the border of Belarus. Now, if you look at the size and scope of the Belarusian military, you would then understand why Belarus may have deployed a third of its military towards its border with the Ukraine. Now look, the Belarusian military in total numbers about 40 to 60,000 personnel. But you have to look at how this force construct is shaped. The ground forces of Belarus have 4 maneuver brigades and a couple of artillery brigades, amounting to about 18 to 20,000 troops. That's the ground forces. Let's go over to this force disposition where you, the viewer, can see exactly what I'm talking about. Additionally, Belarus has a Special Forces Command, which has an additional 3 understrength brigade-sized formations of about 6,000 troops. So at best, in terms of just ground forces, the Belarusians in total, without activating reserves, have about 26,000 ground troops. Now, that's not including the Ministry of the Interior Forces, the internal troops. Well, we're not going to count those because those would not be used in any sort of offensive campaign against the Ukrainians. So it's really important to understand the size and scope of both forces. So again, this was the disposition of Belarusian forces prior to the buildup along the Ukrainian border. As you can see here, the Belarusians had 2 brigades kind of deployed towards the west, the 6th Mechanized Brigade and the 11th Mechanized Brigade. There's also the 120th Mechanized Brigade based near Minsk and the 19th Mechanized Brigade as well. Now, additionally, not displayed on this map are the 3 brigades of the Special Operations Forces. There's an Airborne Brigade, there is an Air Assault Brigade, and there is a Spetsnaz Brigade. So a total, in theory, of 7 maneuver brigades, 4 mechanized, 3 Special Forces, Air Mobile, Air Assault, Airborne. That is not a very large force. That is not a force that is going to be able to launch a military invasion against the Ukraine. It's not. Now, if those forces were augmented with vast amounts of Russian forces, if we had seen the additional deployment of Russian forces into southern Belarus, if we had seen maybe 1 to 2 motorized rifle divisions being deployed to augment these forces, I would say then there is a possibility that the Russians could be looking to launch an operation from Belarus towards Kiev, like they did at the initial start of the war. But those forces aren't present. They're not. The only real sizable Russian forces that are located right now in Belarus are elements of the former Wagner formations. Now, there could be as many as 6,000 to 10,000 Wagner forces training inside of Belarus. But again, is it going to give the Russians the capacity to launch a military operation into northern Ukraine? Probably not. You're going to have a much larger force disposition. The Belarusian Air Force is very small, and obviously that would come under the purview of the Russian Air Force. The Russians are and have been and will continue to use Belarusian airspace to launch strikes against the Ukraine. Now, I would say at this point, it's probably a greater chance that the Ukrainians would actually launch an operation into Belarus under the pretext that, hey, we believe, or we're declaring that the Belarusians are preparing an invasion of northern Ukraine. Now, that is what concerns me. The uninformed urbanite here in the United States and Western Europe, when they hear that a third of the Belarusian army is gathered at the Ukrainian border, augmented by Wagner forces, and if and when the Ukrainians launch a operation against those forces, at least here in the West, here in the United States, that would give validity to that operation. And I have to wonder, is it a possibility that the Ukrainians could be looking at a operation towards Minsk, towards Belarus? What would happen if a large amount of Ukrainian forces crossed into Belarus with the goal of driving towards Minsk? Would they get to Minsk? Probably not. Would they take control of some border areas? Probably. But ultimately, it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to open up a northern front against the Belarusians. Very difficult, but not completely out of the realm of possibility. I mean, we have seen that the Ukrainians, with the Kursk incursion, were willing to expend 10 to 12,000 Ukrainian troops in this sort of operation. So the idea and the possibility that Ukrainian forces could launch a operation into Belarus is something you can't take off the table. You just can't. And especially now, in terms of the desperation right now that is happening in the southern part, in the direction of Pokrovsk, in the direction of New York, essentially along the entire Donbass front, Ukrainian forces are under a great deal of pressure. So the question is what would be the rationale to expand the conflict into Belarus? What would be the rationale? Well, it would also open up a more enhanced possibility of direct NATO intervention. Now look, NATO is intervening in this conflict right now. There are NATO troops on the ground inside of Ukraine. There are North Atlantic Treaty Organization weapon systems being used on a massive scale, both inside of Russia and in the area of conflict. So if the war were to expand to include Belarus, this would increase the chance of direct NATO intervention. Because what is north of Belarus? Well, you have the Baltic states, which are all NATO countries. Again, I go back to the 1980s, the early 90s. If we would have told the Soviet Union, hey, the Baltic states will become part of NATO, Finland will become part of NATO, Romania will become part of NATO with nuclear-capable forces deployed in Romania, I'm thinking the Berlin Wall doesn't come down. I'm thinking that what happened does not happen in terms of the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm thinking World War III at some point starts. If the Soviets, if the Kremlin could see into the future in terms of the state of affairs now. Now, one other issue that is being talked about is the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons by the Russians. We can't take it off the table, especially if a Belarusian front is opened up by the Ukrainians. Now, look, to say this is not going to get out of hand and this war is not going to expand, I think you're kidding yourself. I think we're heading in that direction right now. We are heading in a direction of an expanded conflict. The Russians, right now, the Russians are 100% into winning this war. They fully understand that they cannot lose this conflict, and they're fighting a war of attrition right now designed to expend, degrade, and eventually destroy the Ukrainian military. So the Ukrainian military is going to get desperate because it knows there's an endgame. So if the Ukrainians are desperate, what are they going to do next? And the only real way to conceivably have a positive outcome or a victory or something that they could establish as a victory would be to draw in NATO forces against the Russians. That's their only option right now, other than capitulation, which is coming. It's on the way, and they know that, the Ukrainians. So what are they planning? What is next? Well, we will have to see. So we will continue to watch things on the ground very, very closely. We will continue to report. As always, thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.